Hello and welcome back to Abyssin. Imagine being deep underground alone, cut off from the world, freezing, and with no way out. For some cavers, that nightmare became a terrifying reality. In this video, you'll hear 8 true stories of people who faced pure horror inside caves, battling darkness, hunger, and despair. What happened to these explorers might make you think twice before stepping into a cave yourself. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out. On August 17th, 1996, a group of seasoned cavers was getting ready for another day of exploration inside a newly discovered cave in Tennessee. The place was already starting to show signs of hidden secrets. Mike Rogers, Jack Thomason, Gerald Money, Mike Fico, and Alan Kressler had spent the previous day clearing out debris to open up a narrow passage deep within the cave system. Now, the plan was to push farther in, hoping to uncover untouched tunnels that could lead to even greater discoveries. For these men, caving wasn't just a hobby. It was an obsession. The thrill of crawling through hidden chambers beneath the earth, squeezing through impossibly tight spaces, and discovering passages never touched by humans was what drove them. But with that excitement came real danger. The weight of the mountain above served as a constant reminder that caves are unpredictable places. And in this spot, known by the nickname Hero Bucket Horror Hole, the risk of a collapse was always in the back of their minds. The entrance to the cave was easy to miss, just a narrow opening tucked into a wooded slope leading straight into darkness. The team moved with precision, each carrying their specialized gear, helmets with high-powered lights, elbow and knee pads for crawling, heavy-duty gloves, and hammers for clearing rock and debris. As they descended, the air grew drier and dustier. When they reached the area they had cleared the day before, they took a close look at the passage. The walls were rough and unstable, with loose stones scattered from the digging. It wasn't ideal, but it was passable. The goal now was to get through a newly discovered section. It was a sloped tunnel, barely wide enough to fit a person. From their experience, it didn't seem like there was any real risk of getting stuck. Maybe they were wrong. Jack went in first. He turned sideways, leaning on his left shoulder to squeeze into the opening. The tunnel was about 2 feet high, but way too narrow to crawl through on his stomach, forcing him to flatten his body as much as possible. He dragged himself slowly, chest pressed against the limestone floor as he pushed forward with his feet. The ceiling scraped his back, and every breath felt compressed. Rogers followed behind. He had to lie on his right side in a painfully awkward position. There was no room for regular movement, so he pulled himself forward with his left arm, using his feet against the walls for leverage. But the farther he went, the tighter the space became. Suddenly, Jack stopped. The path ahead was blocked. Loose rocks had fallen overnight, creating a wall of jagged debris. Frustrated, he called back to Rogers that they'd need to break through to continue. Rogers tried to reach for a tool on his belt, but even small movements were a struggle in the tight space. With effort, he managed to twist his arm around and hand the tool to Jack, who began chipping away at the rocks, sending clouds of dust back toward Rogers. The air thickened, and their throats started to burn. Focused on clearing the way, they didn't notice the danger that was building behind them. It only took a few minutes for everything to go wrong. A deep, sharp cracking sound echoed through the tunnel. A large chunk of limestone, loosened by previous digging, broke off from the wall behind Rogers. It was massive. With nothing holding it in place, gravity did the rest. The rock crashed down hard, sending dust and splinters flying, blinding the others waiting outside the tunnel. The impact shoved both Jack and Rogers forward, and Jack's head slammed into the rock. His helmet took the brunt of it, but he was left dazed. When Jack came to, he realized something terrifying. The collapse had completely sealed the way they had come in. They were trapped. The debris still blocked the path forward, and now their only way out was gone. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Then the shock hit. Jack and Rogers were stuck between 2 blocked passages. Thankfully, Rogers hadn't been crushed outright. The falling rock had shoved him forward just enough to avoid a direct hit. If he'd been just a few inches farther back, he could have been pinned to the floor and killed instantly. But they were still in serious trouble. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe, and panic started to creep in. Rogers tried pushing the rock, but there was no space to move. They were surrounded. His heart pounded so loudly it was all he could hear. Jack tried adjusting his position, but the tunnel was too tight for either of them to move much at all. The rapid breathing made things worse. The fear of being stuck there with no way out was overwhelming. But they knew panic would only make it worse. They kept telling themselves they'd make it out, trying to stay calm and trust that their friends would come through. Outside the tunnel, the rest of the team sprang into action. Cave rescues are tricky. Moving a large rock the wrong way could cause another collapse. Every decision had to be made with care. Monty ran out of the cave to find help and managed to borrow a sledgehammer from someone who lived nearby. In the meantime, the others worked with what they had: hammers, pry bars, and chisels, chipping away at the edges of the fallen rock. Inside the tunnel, Jack and Rogers did everything they could to stay calm. They knew that panicking would only burn through their oxygen faster. They also avoided moving too much, afraid of disturbing the unstable rock around them. They conserved energy and focused on slow breathing, listening for the sound of tools chipping away at stone. The work was slow and exhausting. Every swing of the sledgehammer made tiny cracks, but nothing big enough to break through. The narrow space only allowed 1 or 2 people to work at a time, so they had to take turns to avoid burning out. The biggest fear was the vibrations. If they hit too hard, they risked causing another collapse. Outside, the afternoon sun had started to dip below the horizon, but inside the cave, time felt like it had stopped. The only light came from their helmet lamps. Sweat mixed with mud trickled down their exhausted faces. After more than 4 grueling hours, they finally made a breakthrough. A well-placed strike created a deep fracture in the center of the rock. With one last team effort, they broke it into smaller pieces, opening a gap just wide enough for Jack to squeeze through. As soon as he got out, he collapsed to the ground. A wave of relief swept over everyone. They had done it. It was only then that the full weight of what had happened hit them. Freshly discovered passages are naturally unstable. Any sign of loose rock needs to be taken seriously. Clearing debris might open up new paths, but it can also weaken the surrounding structure. For Jack and Rogers, it was a terrifying experience, one that deepened their respect for the unpredictable world hidden beneath our feet. Rogers and Jack went through a desperate situation, but it could have been even worse. And that's exactly what we'll see in the next story. On May 11th, 1996, an experienced team of cavers consisting of 11 members along with government-appointed safety specialists ventured into the Midnight Creek Cave in California. Since '94, the site had been off-limits due to dangerously high levels of hydrogen sulfide found in the water. Their mission was to monitor the toxic gas levels and assess the overall condition of the site. But what was supposed to be a supervised expedition quickly turned into a nightmare for one team member. To explore the cave's most hazardous zones more effectively, the group split into smaller teams. Richard Breisch, Colin O'Neill, Kurt Wexel, and Renee Van Vreswijk made up the team tasked with securing the rear section. They set up gas detectors to monitor hydrogen sulfide levels in the air and collected water samples to test for hazardous chemicals, especially sulfur compounds. Each member had responsibility for watching over a specific part of the cave, while the safety specialist kept a close eye on any signs of structural instability in the rock formations. At first, everything seemed to be under control. The progress through the upper sections of the route went smoothly, but on the way back, things took a terrifying turn. Richard, who was leading his team, stepped onto what looked like solid ground, but turned out to be a slippery, moss-covered rock. In a split second, he lost his footing and fell into a narrow vertical shaft, a natural chimney where water was flowing through. His torso twisted unnaturally, and his head plunged into the freezing water. The force of the fall wedged him tightly in place, with his legs pointing upward and his chest pressed against the rock walls. The icy current wrapped around him, filling his nose and mouth with freezing water. In desperation, he tilted his head back, trying to create a tiny air pocket so he could breathe. The ever-present threat of hydrogen sulfide made the situation even more terrifying. If he didn't get free soon, he would suffocate from the toxic gas. In a moment of sheer panic, Richard wondered if anyone had seen him fall. The fear of being trapped alone with no chance of rescue triggered a surge of adrenaline. He felt as if an invisible force was pressing his head underwater. Every attempt to keep his face above the surface demanded tremendous effort, and his muscles trembled from the strain. Above him, Colin O'Neill had witnessed the fall and immediately rushed to help. But in his urgency, he underestimated just how slippery the rocks were and ended up slipping himself, falling into the same shaft. His fall forced Richard even deeper into the narrow cavity, making his situation even more critical. Colin struggled to free himself and shouted for help. Renee and Kurt, hearing the cries, came running. With great effort, Renee managed to pull Colin out of the shaft, but Richard remained trapped. Every second mattered, and the danger of toxic gas buildup made the situation increasingly dire. Renee and Kurt frantically consulted their maps, trying to locate an alternative route that would lead to the lower part of the shaft. If they could find it, they might be able to push Richard up instead of accidentally pressing him down farther. While Renee and Kurt searched for this path, Colin stayed by Richard's side to try to comfort him, but Richard's condition was getting worse. His efforts to keep his head above water were becoming painfully exhausting. His body trembled uncontrollably, and his labored breathing became more and more desperate. After what felt like an eternity, Renee and Kurt found a narrow, waterlogged passage leading to the bottom of the shaft. The route was stiflingly tight, but they had no other choice. They squeezed through the narrow opening, struggling with every inch. At last, they reached the base of the shaft. From there, they could see Richard, clearly in distress. At that moment, Van arrived at the scene. Without hesitation, he sprang into action. Together with Colin, he grabbed hold of Richard's legs while Colin and Renee pushed from below. The position was extremely awkward, and the narrow walls of the shaft made every move a challenge. Richard felt the pressure from beneath and tried to help with what little strength he had left. His injured shoulder sent waves of pain through his body, but inch by inch, he began to rise. The water level dropped just enough for him to breathe a little easier. Re-energized by the small victory, his friends doubled their efforts. With one final synchronized push, Richard's chest finally cleared the shaft. Colin grabbed him firmly by the arms and pulled him onto a rocky ledge, where his body collapsed like a rag doll. He lay there, violently shivering, struggling to breathe the damp air of the cave. His companions quickly gathered around to check his injuries. Although he was seriously hurt, likely with a dislocated shoulder, he was alive. Getting out of Midnight Creek Cave was still a daunting task, especially since Richard had lost his glasses. As the only one who knew the complex layout of the cave, he was the team's best hope for navigating back to the surface. Without his vision, the dim light from their carbide lamps barely helped to reveal the way. Every shadow seemed to shift, turning the already treacherous terrain into a true labyrinth. His companions stayed close to him, offering as much help as they could, but the group's navigation relied almost entirely on Richard. Step by cautious step, the team made slow progress toward the exit. When they finally emerged under the starry sky, the sight of the open night felt like a hard-won victory over the suffocating darkness of the cave. Their nightmare had finally come to an end. Looking back, it was clear that Richard's survival had only been possible thanks to the quick thinking and determination of his companions. Without their combined efforts, the outcome would likely have been tragic. Midnight Creek Cave, with its hidden dangers and unforgiving terrain, had tested every one of them in unimaginable ways. What they faced was definitely agonizing, but sometimes entering a cave isn't even a choice. That's what the next story is all about. It was a freezing day, December 21st, 1981, when 34-year-old Jeff Hogue from Luttrell, Tennessee, decided to head out on foot. The plan was simple: borrow a friend's pickup truck and drive to North Carolina, about 120 miles away. But when the truck wouldn't start, a frustrated Jeff opted to go for a walk, probably to clear his head. What he didn't expect was the biting cold and the treacherous terrain that awaited him. He chose a path that led through a remote part of Knox County, known for a large natural sinkhole that connects to an underground cave system. The freezing rain had turned the ground into a slick, dangerous trap. Determined, Jeff kept walking for about a mile from his friend's house, but luck was about to run out. As he crossed a dense, wooded area, Jeff lost his footing on the muddy ground. He tried to catch himself, but had no chance. He slipped and slid uncontrollably before plunging straight into a hole hidden beneath the vegetation. It was a sinkhole, a deep crevice he hadn't seen until it was too late. He fell nearly 20 feet into the darkness of a narrow shaft with slick, wet walls. At the bottom of the pit, disoriented and gasping for air, Jeff tried to grasp the severity of the situation. Miraculously, he hadn't broken any bones, but he was now trapped in a tight space surrounded by tall, muddy walls. Each attempt to climb out only made things worse. His fingers sank into the soft earth and he slid right back down. The more he struggled, the deeper he seemed to sink. With the cold intensifying and no food or shelter, panic began to set in. At night, the temperature plummeted and his body shook uncontrollably. He hugged himself and rubbed his hands together, trying to generate warmth, but the cold pierced through his clothes and settled deep in his bones. He shouted for help, but his voice barely made it through the thick earth above. The silence was suffocating. The next day brought no relief. The sun warmed things up slightly, making Jeff sweat, but there was no way to replace what he was losing. He started collecting tiny droplets of water that trickled down the muddy walls using his cupped hands. In a desperate attempt, he tried to fashion a rope. He tore pieces of his clothing, even his underwear, braided them together and tied them to branches he found nearby. But the soft ground couldn't hold his weight, and he kept falling back down. As the days passed, the cold became unbearable. Jeff shivered violently. He started hallucinating, seeing shadows and hearing voices. He imagined people looking down at him from the surface, but when he focused, there was no one there. His hands and face were raw from the constant mud, and his feet were swollen from being soaked in cold, wet soil. He was too weak to even call out. By the 6th day, he was giving up. Out of strength, out of ideas, and with his body deteriorating, time felt like it was slipping away. He knew he was losing weight fast and couldn't last much longer, but just when everything seemed lost, something changed. 8 days after his fall, 3 local teenagers, Mike, Daryl, and Cody, were out in the woods hunting squirrels. While walking along a barely used trail, they noticed something strange, a large hole in the ground. Curious, they moved closer and stood in silence, listening. For a few seconds, nothing. Then a faint cough echoed from below, a rough, barely audible sound. They shouted, asking if anyone was down there. Jeff thought he was hallucinating again, but when he heard their voices a second time, he knew it was real. Using every bit of strength he had left, he yelled as loud as he could. Slowly, through his blurred vision, he saw faces looking down from above. The boys realized someone was trapped and ran off to get help. Before long, rescue teams arrived with ropes and equipment. A rescuer was carefully lowered into the hole where Jeff was barely conscious. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and his body cold and frail. Gently, they secured him into a harness and began lifting him out. Every inch of the ascent felt like a race against time, but they made it. Jeff was finally pulled from the hole that nearly became his grave. He had spent 8 days in total isolation, lost over 25 pounds, and was severely dehydrated and hypothermic. His body temperature had dropped to around 84 degrees Fahrenheit. He was rushed to the hospital where he was treated for hypothermia, dehydration, and a serious foot infection caused by prolonged exposure to moisture. Despite the physical toll, Jeff survived to tell his story. Jeff didn't choose to be in a cave, it was a tragic accident. But that's not the case in our next story. On May 17th, 2003, Gerard Watt and two of his friends, all experienced cavers, arrived early at Buckner's Cave in Indiana. They were excited and ready to take on the winding tunnels and narrow passages of the rocky terrain. The thrill came not only from the potential of uncovering new paths, but also from the strong bond they shared, built on previous adventures underground. The entrance to the cave was familiar, even comforting, and everything seemed to be going as planned. But none of them could have predicted that, in less than 24 hours, this trip would become a grueling battle against the raw forces of nature and their own limits. As they ventured deeper into the cave, the tunnels grew tighter and the air heavier. Still, the trio pressed on until they reached one of the most challenging areas, a tight squeeze above a stream known by locals as Purgatory. The path was steep and tricky, requiring careful movement. One by one, they began making their way through. Gerard went first. Taking a deep breath, he wedged himself into the vertical opening, using his feet for support and his arms to pull himself up, while the beam from his headlamp lit the narrow path ahead. His shoulders and hips constantly scraped against the rock. He was used to tight spaces, but this felt different. The tunnel narrowed in subtle ways he hadn't expected. Then suddenly he stopped moving. His body was wedged tightly between the rock walls, his torso twisted in an awkward position, making it impossible to go forward or back. He tried shifting his arms and legs, forcing his body against the stone, but only ended up stuck deeper. He was completely immobilized. One friend tried to pull him back, but every attempt made the space feel even tighter. Realizing they couldn't free him on their own, they made a quick decision. One friend stayed with Gerard to provide support, while the other crawled back out of the cave to get help. Time dragged on painfully slow. Gerard was trembling, struggling to breathe in the confined space. The damp air seeped into his bones, and hypothermia started to take hold. Every ache, every fear was intensified by the complete silence of the cave. Hours later, hope returned in the form of voices echoing from the cave's entrance. The rescue team had arrived, bringing their tools and expertise. They carefully assessed the situation. The passage was incredibly tight, compressing Gerard's chest and limbs, restricting blood flow and movement. As the night wore on, rescuers began drilling and chiseling the rock with extreme precision to free him. Each strike echoed through the tunnel. Gerard focused on his breathing, trying to stay calm. The cold was brutal, and his fingers and toes were going numb. But he held on while the team worked with determination. As morning approached, their efforts intensified. Finally, a slab of rock wedged against his side broke loose. That gave him just enough room to shift slightly. Encouraged by the rescuers, he moved slowly and eventually slipped free, tumbling into the stream below, exhausted but relieved. Despite muscle aches and extreme fatigue, Gerard was finally free. The rescuers wrapped him in lithodermal blankets, gave him water and energy bars to help him recover. His hands trembled as he held the bottle. The weight of what he had endured began to hit him. He was sore and worn out, but alive and without serious injuries. Gerard's experience was painful, no doubt, but not as much as what comes next. On the morning of October 17th, 2009, a group of 4 seasoned cavers led by 45-year-old John Haber gathered to explore Fang Cave through a mid-level entrance. Fang Cave is located in British Columbia, Canada, deep within the McGregor Range Mountains, northeast of the city of Prince George. It's one of the largest and best-known caves in the country. Alongside John were Mike Nash and 2 other members of the Alpine Club, all of them well-versed in navigating the challenges of underground environments. This trip was considered routine, and they were well-equipped to face whatever obstacles lay ahead in the cave's dark and winding tunnels. However, their journey would soon take a dramatic and life-threatening turn. As they arrived at the mid-level entry point, they began their descent. To reach a large chamber known as the Colosseum, they used an existing anchor point and set up their ropes with an expansion bolt. They rigged a doubled 9mm aerodynamic rope to allow all members to descend safely. The Colosseum was spacious, but the path ahead led to a section called the Corkscrew, a steep and narrow passage that got increasingly vertical. To descend further, they anchored an 11mm dynamic rope around a large rock pillar at the top of the Corkscrew. This section was especially tricky, full of twists and sharp turns that demanded skill and concentration. During the descent, they also placed a camelot in a crack about 10 feet above a small ledge to provide extra security. With this setup, 2 people could ascend or descend at the same time, ensuring a safer and more stable progression. After quite a bit of effort, the team finally reached the base of the Corkscrew, a critical section of the cave. From this point on, they knew they were getting close to the deeper zones. The upper part of the Corkscrew had already been tough, but the lower portion was even tighter and steeper, forcing them to adjust their posture and move with extreme caution. Pushing forward through the increasingly narrow corridors, the team reached the furthest point they had planned to explore. The air was getting heavy, and the walls seemed to close in on them. While there was a sense of achievement, there was also a clear understanding that the climb back up would be far more physically draining. Still, everything was going smoothly. With their experience, they moved efficiently, handling their gear with precision to ensure their safety. But hidden dangers are part of any cave system. After spending some time at the bottom of the Corkscrew, they started their ascent. John Haber went first, carefully navigating the tightest sections. When he reached the spot where the camelot had been placed, he noticed it had shifted out of the rock crack, compromising the rope's stability. John immediately repositioned it to try to restore a solid anchor. Then he called Mike Nash to start climbing, following the standard protocol for vertical progression in caves. Mike got ready, and as soon as he put weight on the rope, disaster struck. The pressure caused the crack holding the camelot to fail, breaking off a massive chunk of rock. The heavy rock slammed into John with incredible force, throwing him violently onto the platform just below. It pinned him underneath, partially submerged in a shallow pool of water. He was knocked unconscious and, worse, wasn't breathing. The sound of the impact echoed through the cave. The rest of the team rushed to John in panic. They found him completely motionless, his torso crushed beneath the rock. Using all their strength, they managed to lift the massive slab off of him, but John remained unresponsive, his body limp. The team was now facing a nightmare scenario. Their friend was critically injured. Despite their attempts to revive him, John remained unconscious and in serious condition. In addition to visible scrapes, he had sustained multiple fractures. 7 broken ribs on the right side, 3 on the left, a shattered collarbone, a fractured shoulder, and a collapsed lung. There were also concerns about a possible spinal injury, though there was no way to confirm it in the chaos. Realizing he wasn't breathing, they immediately started CPR. Their quick response brought him back, and he slowly began to regain consciousness, although he was extremely weak. Meanwhile, a second team led by Tamara Kostya was entering the cave with 3 newer members. They were familiar with Fang Cave, but unaware of the accident. Upon reaching the Colosseum, they were told by someone from the first group that the upper team would take longer than expected. Tamara chose to continue exploring, but when she reached the top of the Corkscrew, she realized they didn't have enough rope to make a full descent. She made the decision to abort the mission and head back. That's when one of the Alpine Club members alerted her to the serious accident. Tamara immediately understood the urgency and sent one of her teammates to retrieve the satellite phone left near the entrance. Once they had the device, she placed an emergency call that was routed to the Global Star Center in Texas and then relayed to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Prince George. This triggered a large-scale search and rescue operation. Specialized teams, including the British Columbia Cave Rescue, BCCR, quickly mobilized. While waiting for help, Tamara focused on keeping John alive. She got him out of the cold water, dressed him in dry clothes, and propped him into a semi-seated position to help retain body heat. The rescue operation kicked off around 7 p.m., when 2 helicopters arrived with rescuers and gear. By that time, John had lost consciousness again and was struggling to breathe, raising fears he might not make it. At 8:15 p.m., the actual extraction began. Using a spinal immobilization device and a specialized Furno Washington stretcher, the team began the grueling process of lifting him out of the cave with pulleys and vertical rope systems. By 9:30 p.m., they had reached the Coliseum. They noticed that John's breathing improved when his head was elevated, so they adjusted his position and applied thermal packs to try to stabilize his condition. Even in his critical state, John showed an incredible will to survive, fighting to stay awake and aware. By 11:30 p.m., they reached the mid-level exit. Though he was still in bad shape, he was stable enough to be carried along the mountain trail. What followed was a more than 3-hour journey, during which exhausted rescuers took turns carrying him carefully to the extraction point, where a helicopter was waiting. After hours of nonstop effort, John was finally flown to the hospital. Doctors confirmed the extent of his injuries, multiple fractures, a collapsed lung, and other serious trauma. But thanks to the fast and well-coordinated rescue operation, he survived. John remained in stable condition after 2 days in intensive care, and after a long recovery, he was able to return to his normal life. John lived through a terrifying ordeal, but even that pales in comparison to our next story. The morning of October 7, 2001, started like many other fall Sundays in upstate New York. The Gage Caverns, a natural limestone cave system near the town of Shohari, were well known for attracting adventurers fascinated by the underground world. Around 10:30 a.m., 5 friends arrived at the cave entrance: Edward Galbavy, Kevin Shaw, Shioku Kudo, Adam Dobson, and J.J. Bradingham. The group included both experienced cavers and curious newcomers, all excited to explore the mysterious landscape. The spot had a reputation among local explorers for having both dry sections and wet passages where small streams still trickled. The friends had prepared carefully. They wore helmets with mounted headlamps, carried backup flashlights and extra batteries, along with bottled water and some light snacks. Their clothes were rugged and ready for dirt: old jeans, long-sleeved shirts, and sturdy boots with good traction to avoid slipping on damp surfaces. The more seasoned members carried small backpacks with basic emergency supplies, including first aid kits. Before entering, they checked their gear one last time and signed the cave's logbook, a crucial safety measure to show who's inside and when they're expected to exit. The outside temperature was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a typical autumn chill, but they knew the cave would stay at a constant 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. At around 11 a.m., they began the descent through the main entrance, a dark crack in the hillside that quickly swallowed the daylight. The first chamber was spacious enough for all 5 to stand comfortably, but as they ventured deeper, the corridors narrowed. They chose to explore the dry section first, which included a tricky stretch known as the balls down crawl, a tight tunnel that required crawling flat on one's stomach. In some spots, it was necessary to exhale completely just to squeeze through the gaps. The first 2 hours went smoothly. They took pictures, chatted about the rock formations, and enjoyed the eerie atmosphere. Around 1 p.m., they returned to a larger area known as the amphitheater, a chamber where several paths converged. It was about the size of a small classroom and tall enough for everyone to stand upright. There they took a break to eat, rest, and plan their next move. That's when a small opening in the rock wall caught the attention of Shioku Kudo, a 28-year-old graduate student with only a few cave explorations under her belt. She became curious about a horizontal gap that seemed to lead into another chamber. The opening was about 24 inches wide and 18 inches high, just large enough for a slim person to slip through sideways. Being the smallest in the group, Kudo volunteered to check it out. She laid on her side and slowly started inching her way inside. But right from the beginning, things started going wrong. What looked like a straight passage actually curved sharply to the right just a few feet in, something invisible from the outside. To continue, Kudo had to twist her body, with her torso now facing the new direction while her legs remained aligned with the entrance, forming a right angle. Things got serious quickly. The passage narrowed even more right where her chest was pressed against the rock. When she tried to move forward or back, she realized she was completely stuck. The rocks were pressing painfully against her ribs, making it hard to breathe. The jagged surface scraped her sides, and her breath grew shallow. She called out for her friends, trying to stay calm, but panic began to rise. Kevin Shaw and Edward Galbavy were the first to try and help. They offered instructions, suggested new angles, and tried pulling her by the legs or pushing from the shoulders, but nothing worked. Every attempt seemed to wedge her in even more. The 90-degree turn had created a natural trap, easy to enter, nearly impossible to exit. The pressure on her ribcage was making it hard to breathe, and she couldn't move her arms to help herself. After many failed attempts, it became clear they needed professional help. The constant 52 degrees Fahrenheit temperature in the cave posed another risk. Without being able to move, Kudo would start to lose body heat fast, increasing the danger of hypothermia. Shaw volunteered to exit the cave and call for help, while the others stayed with her, trying to keep her conscious and in good spirits. He moved quickly through the cave and emerged around 1:30 p.m. As soon as he had cell reception, he called emergency services and gave a detailed report of the situation and Kudo's location inside the cave. Specialized cave rescue teams were mobilized, including paramedics and emergency technicians. Back inside, Kudo's discomfort kept worsening. The pressure on her ribs made every breath agonizing. The hard ground made her arm and hip go numb. The darkness, the tight space, and the uncertainty took a toll on her mentally. By 2:15 p.m., the first rescuers reached the cave entrance. They brought ropes, communication gear, medical supplies, and tools for clearing rock. They quickly organized into teams and headed toward the amphitheater. By 3 p.m., the first medical team reached Kudo. A paramedic checked her vital signs. She had been stuck for nearly 2 hours, her lips turning blue from cold and restricted breathing. They tried similar techniques to those used earlier: gentle tugs, coordinated pushes, lubricant to reduce friction, and even rocking motions to free her, but her twisted and compressed position made any movement impossible. As night fell, more specialized rescuers arrived with advanced tools. They set up bright lighting to better see the situation and coordinated communications for the ongoing operation. By 5 p.m., nearly 4 hours had passed since Kudo got trapped, and her condition was increasingly concerning. The pain was intense and the cold exhausting. At 7:20 p.m., two experienced cavers, Joe Armstrong and Ken Fortuan, arrived with tools designed for tight spaces like chisels and handheld drills. They realized the only option was to remove some of the rock surrounding Kudo. It was delicate and risky work. One wrong move could cause a collapse or release dust that would make it even harder for her to breathe. They carefully identified the safest areas to chip away. Over the next hour and a half, they slowly removed small pieces of rock inch by inch. Kudo remained conscious but was growing increasingly exhausted. She had now been stuck for almost 8 hours, with her body compressed and air supply dwindling. Finally, shortly after 9 p.m., Armstrong and Fortuin managed to clear enough space to free her. The pain was intense as blood returned to areas that had been compressed for so long. She was immediately wrapped in thermal blankets and treated for hypothermia and crush injuries. Her ribs were badly bruised and parts of her body had gone numb. Before starting the return trip, the team gave Kudo time to recover. She sipped warm liquids and rested for about an hour. Once she felt strong enough, they helped her back through the cave. At 10:20 p.m., nearly 9.5 hours after getting trapped, Shioku Kudo finally emerged from the Gage Caverns into the cold night air. An ambulance took her straight to the hospital, where she underwent tests and received care. Amazingly, despite everything she went through, Kudo didn't suffer any permanent damage. Her injuries were limited to severe bruising, temporary nerve compression, and the psychological scars from the experience. After the ordeal, local experts like Tom Engel noted that there had been some confusion during the early stages of the rescue about how long Kudo had been stuck, which may have delayed the full-scale response. He emphasized that in cave rescues, if someone isn't freed within 15 minutes, external help should be called right away. In the end, Shioku survived a true nightmare. Being with other cavers was key to Kudo's survival, but sadly, that wasn't the case in the next story. One of the longest disappearances in the history of caving, in my opinion. Thomas Edward Benning, a man who lived for adventure, decided to explore Black Cave, located in the state of Arizona, on a calm April day in 1995. This wasn't his first time in that cave. He had explored it before, which gave him a sense of confidence, but this time, he decided to go alone. He didn't bring a helmet, just a miner's flashlight and trust in his own sense of direction. Not exactly the safest plan, but it had worked before. As you'll notice, this is a common theme in the stories I share here. Overconfidence often plays a major role in these tragedies. Honestly, the bare minimum for entering a cave should include safety gear and never going alone. As soon as he entered, he reached the main chamber, a wider area he already knew well. But instead of following his usual path, something pulled him toward a side tunnel. It was a less obvious route, narrower, darker, and barely explored. After about an hour of crawling and climbing through rocks and tight spaces, Thomas realized he was lost. It felt like the cave had swallowed him whole. He tried to retrace his steps to find familiar landmarks, but nothing looked the same. It was a maze beneath the earth. And to make matters worse, his flashlight began flickering. Inside that cave, time stopped making sense. Hours felt like days, and it was impossible to tell how long he had been crawling through the dark. His heart pounded. Without light, finding a way out would be nearly impossible. A short while later, the flashlight died completely, plunging him into absolute darkness, several hundred feet underground. He was alone, with no source of light. Every breath echoed off the walls, as if the cave itself was listening. The air was thick and heavy, damp with moisture, and a faint metallic scent. The silence was so complete that he could hear the rapid thumping of his own heart. With a last bit of hope, Thomas lit a match. The flame was weak, but for a moment it lit up the surrounding rock. That brief flicker sparked a little hope. He kept lighting match after match, trying to move forward using those tiny bursts of light. But the matches didn't last forever. When the last one burned out, he was once again consumed by pitch blackness. Still, he didn't stop. He crawled forward, feeling the walls, desperate for any sign of an exit. To avoid going in circles, he started leaving things behind. His shoes, a torn plastic bag, even pieces of clothing to mark the path he had taken. As more time passed, his throat burned with thirst. Swallowing became painful, like glass scraping down his throat. His vision blurred and his muscles began to shake, not from the cold, but from complete exhaustion. Worn out, starving, and dehydrated, he eventually came across a narrow crack in the rock. The small space, just about 4 feet deep, looked like it might lead somewhere. Maybe it opened into a larger area. Maybe it was a way out. That flicker of hope was enough. Thomas carefully lowered himself in, pressing his foot against a ledge for balance. But as his hips passed through the narrowest part, he realized his mistake. He was stuck. The rough walls squeezed in from both sides. He tried to move, to push himself back up, but it was no use. The more he struggled, the deeper he sank. He fought with the last strength he had, trying to use his arms to lift himself, but they were too weak after hours of strain. His fingernails scraped uselessly against the rock. His legs were trapped, his entire body pinned down by the very cave he once admired. And even if he screamed for help, his voice barely carried through that deep, silent void. Minutes turned into hours turned into days. No one knew exactly where he had gone. Thomas hadn't told anyone which cave he planned to visit. His wife became worried when he didn't come home. She called the police, who began searching every cave he was known to explore, but there were no signs. It took days just to find his car, parked not far from the entrance to Black Cave. Rescue teams entered the cave, but since they didn't know the hidden passages, they only searched the mapped areas. Near the entrance, they found a few of Thomas's belongings, including a t-shirt and a pair of sunglasses. But they overlooked the narrow side tunnel he had chosen. They combed through every known route and found nothing. Days turned into weeks. Eventually, the search was called off. Officially, Thomas Edward Benning was listed as missing. His wife didn't give up. She put up flyers, made public pleas, reached out to anyone who might know something, but the response was always the same. The search was over. All that remained were memories and unanswered questions about what had happened to him in that underground world. It wasn't until December 1996, more than a year and a half later, that the mystery began to unravel. 3 cavers, Bill Graff, Elizabeth Robb, and Dale Green, entered Black Cave. They were doing a mapping project and decided to explore that very side passage, the same one Thomas had taken. About an hour in, they found something strange, a half-burned box of matches on the floor. A bit farther in, they saw a broken miner's flashlight. Then more signs appeared. Burnt matches, torn pieces of clothing. It looked like someone had left a trail there long ago. At first, they didn't think much of it, but as they made their way back later that day, curiosity got the better of them. They decided to look deeper into the side tunnel where the objects had been found. It was narrow, less than 3 feet wide, and sloped into an even tighter space. Crawling through, Rob came across a shoe, then a sock, then something unusual on the ground. At first glance, it looked like a pile of animal fur, but as they got closer, they realized what it really was, something far more disturbing. They froze in place. It was the body of Thomas Edward Benning. They had heard about his disappearance months earlier, but never imagined he had been there the whole time. They took photos of the scene and collected the keys they found on him for identification. Looking closer, they noticed deep scratches on the rock, evidence of a desperate fight to break free. Before leaving, they placed reflective markers to guide others to the site. They immediately notified the sheriff. Days later, a specialized recovery team was sent in, this time with experts in navigating tight spaces. After multiple attempts, they managed to retrieve Thomas's body. The wallet still in his pocket confirmed his identity. Thomas had been trapped in that cave for nearly 20 months. A place he had explored many times before ended up becoming his grave. If only the first rescuers had known the cave's secrets. If only experienced cavers had been brought in sooner, maybe Thomas would still be alive. But Black Cave kept its secret, buried in the darkness for far too long. Being alone likely cost Thomas his life. But even with experienced cavers by your side, things can still go horribly wrong, as you'll see in the next story. On the chilly night of October 9th, 2004, the cold Colorado air stung the skin of Ryan Gossieju, Franz Hankins, and Josie Goodlow as they approached the entrance of Narrows Cave. The cave loomed ahead like a silent, breathing void. For Ryan, the group's leader and an experienced caver, it was just another thrilling adventure. For Josie, who was still new to the underground world, the feeling was a mix of fear and adrenaline, a true plunge into the unknown. Franz, at 35 and solidly built, had enough experience to feel confident, but far from relaxed. The trio exchanged light jokes while adjusting their helmets and checking their headlamps. As soon as they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The sounds of rustling leaves and distant wildlife gave way to the muffled echoes of their own movements. Every step had to be deliberate. The uneven ground demanded constant focus, and the walls seemed to press in tighter with every foot they descended deeper into the earth. By the time they reached the top of a chamber known as Spring Canyon, the narrow tunnels gave the unsettling impression that the cave had a mind of its own, silently watching them. The next stretch was a real squeeze, so tight it could only be crossed by crawling on their stomachs. Ryan went first. His movements were steady and calm, his breathing controlled. Franz followed close behind, grunting occasionally as his broad frame scraped against the rock. Josie hesitated at the entrance, her hands trembling as she prepared to enter the claustrophobic gap. As he dragged himself forward, Franz felt the rough rock pressing against his chest and shoulders. He kept moving until his fingers brushed against a protruding stone. Sensing it was loose, he instinctively pushed on it for leverage. That was a critical mistake. The stone held for a moment, then gave way with a harsh crack. The ceiling groaned, and before he could react, massive slabs of rock crashed down with a deafening roar that echoed like thunder through the tunnel. Dust and debris exploded around him, blinding his vision and choking the air. One of the boulders slammed into his torso, pinning his head and left arm against the wall. Franz let out a raw, guttural scream as the weight of the rock lifted his legs off the floor, contorting his body into a horrifying shape. Dirt and gravel began to cover his face, making it harder to breathe. He gasped for air, his chest crushed against the merciless stone. Josie froze, wide-eyed and panicked at the scene. She screamed, her voice high and shaking. Ryan, who had already passed through the tunnel, spun around at the sound. His stomach twisted when he saw Franz trapped, his head barely visible through the rubble. He called out, and Franz responded with a faint groan. Josie crawled toward him, trying to dig through the debris with trembling hands. Ryan quickly assessed the situation. Franz was alive but in serious trouble. The boulder had pinned him tightly, and the growing pile of debris was suffocating him. They needed help. The rock had locked him in place, and the pressure, combined with the inability to move, posed serious risks. Circulation could be cut off. Internal damage was a real threat. Worse still, panic sets in fast. Breathing quickens, but in such a confined space, there's not enough air. Oxygen runs out quickly, and caves are cold. With no way to move, Franz was rapidly losing body heat. The danger went beyond being crushed. Hypothermia, organ failure, or even suffocation were real possibilities. In total darkness, with no idea if help would come, panic escalated. Ryan knew he had to act fast. He began a grueling trek through an alternate path in the cave, relying on every bit of his knowledge of the layout. Each yard felt endless. His arms and legs burned with effort as he dragged himself through the tight passages, barely noticing the sharp rocks slicing his elbows and knees. All that mattered was reaching the surface. When he finally emerged from the cave, panting and bloodied, he grabbed his phone and called Mike Frazier, a veteran cave rescuer. He described Franz's condition and the severity of the collapse in precise detail. Mike wasted no time. He grabbed his gear, including a hydraulic jack, and called in backup as he drove toward the site. He knew every second counted. At the trailhead, he found Ryan waiting, pale and tense. They hurried back into the cave toward the spot where Franz was trapped. The sight was grim. Franz's face was ghostly and caked in dirt, pinned beneath the crushing weight of the slab. His body showed signs of shutting down. Breathing was shallow, each gasp a battle. His left arm had gone numb down to the fingertips, and his legs, still suspended in the air, trembled uncontrollably. The blood pooling in his head made him dizzy, close to passing out. The cave's chill seeped into his bones, draining the last of his strength. He tried to move, but the rock held fast. His voice, once steady, was now a faint whisper. Josie remained by his side, her hands torn and bleeding from trying to free him. Mike stayed calm, carefully surveying the unstable ceiling and the stone's position. He began clearing debris with his bare hands, scooping away dirt and rocks around Franz's head. The tunnel was so tight that he had to carry each load to a small chamber about 15 feet away. Every trip was physically and mentally exhausting. After multiple trips, he uncovered Franz's left hand, swollen and limp. He kept digging until he found the helmet, badly warped by the pressure. Gently, he unclipped the strap and removed it, letting Franz breathe a bit easier. Ryan joined the effort, holding Franz's legs and trying to pull him free. Franz's scream echoed through the cave, but the upper part of his body wouldn't budge. The ceiling groaned again, sending a chill through everyone. Time was running out. At 11 p.m., more rescuers arrived, focused but visibly tense. They brought in support beams and additional hydraulic jacks. They worked quickly to brace the ceiling and position the jack beneath the rock. Mike began lifting the boulder slowly. The sound of the shifting weight filled the narrow chamber. Inch by inch, the slab rose. When there was finally enough room, Ryan and another rescuer pulled Franz with all their strength. A sickening crack echoed as his body came free. The tunnel collapsed immediately afterward, burying the equipment and sealing off the path. Everyone froze in stunned silence. They had escaped death by mere seconds. Franz, now free, was in shock and barely conscious. His arm was swollen and purple. The rescuers moved fast, wrapping him in a thermal blanket and fashioning a makeshift sling. After a few minutes, some color returned to his face, and he started regaining feeling in his fingers. Getting out of the cave still required strength. The group carefully navigated the steep, uneven steps of Spring Canyon. Just past midnight, they met another rescue team with a special stretcher. Franz, too weak to walk, was strapped in. The team took turns carrying and dragging his body through the remaining passages. They were all physically drained. When they finally reached a walkable tunnel, Franz, determined to leave on his own feet, asked to be taken off the stretcher. His legs barely held him, but with the help of his team, he kept moving. At 2 a.m., they emerged from the cave. Franz's wife was waiting, tears streaming down her face as she hugged him tightly. He had made it out alive, narrowly escaping death. If you enjoyed these stories, click the video on your screen. It'll take you to another cave exploration that went horribly wrong. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot. Thank you from the bottom of my heart to everyone who's been watching, and I'll see you in the next video.